Week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, so you know exactly what we need to do. We need to go through every single matchup and break down every single player at the quarterback and tight end position and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 10 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 10's action. And on top of that, all new users on Underdog who sign up with promo code THECATCH are also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em for this week's action and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. All right, very quickly, we have 4 teams on bye week this week. So starting with the Green Bay Packers, no Jordan Love, no Tucker Kraft, no Cleveland Browns, so no Jameis Winston, no David Njoku, no Vegas Raiders this week. So, no Gardner Minshew, no Brock Bowers. And the Seattle Seahawks, our final team on bye week this week. So no Geno Smith or Noah Fant. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, so let's start with Thursday Night Football. We have the Bengals traveling to face the Ravens. Should be a nice Thursday night matchup. Let's start with the Bengals side of things. Joe Burrow is a quarterback that I'm starting on a week in, week out basis. So I know week 7 and 8, we saw much lower ceilings for Burrow with 14.9 and 13.8 fantasy points. But going into week 9, still a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football. Just told you guys, keep rolling with the punches. That paid off. 30 fantasy points in week 9. We go back to week 3. He has 18 or more fantasy, or excuse me, actually 19 or more fantasy points in 4 out of those 7 matchups. So overall, Burrow has been very solid. Just keep rolling with the punches here. Start him on a short week. And what's a fantastic matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. Burrow, a solid start this week. I think that Mike Gesicki, who was a player we talked about in Sunday morning's video as a very strong streaming candidate at the tight end position going into week 9, is once again a solid streaming option this week. Now, we may get T. Higgins active this week, which will definitely impact the potential volume we get from Mike Gesicki. But this is a fantastic matchup as the Ravens have also struggled against the tight end position, giving up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends on the season. So I don't quite know if we're going to see another 20-plus performance out of Mike Gesicki if T. Higgins plays in this game, but the matchup is very good. Gesicki is a strong start this week. Then on the other hand, for the Ravens, we continue to start Lamar Jackson no matter what. 23 fantasy points in week 9, 280 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. This was his first game on the season where he had under 40 rushing yards, his worst rushing mark of the season against the Denver Broncos with just 4 rushing yards. Doesn't matter. It's Lamar Jackson. He's going to find a way to get it done. Keep him in your starting lineups no matter what. He's your QB1 on the season. All right, Mark Andrews. I still think he's a strong start. You just kind of roll with the punches here. Take what you can get. The Bengals have been pretty good against the tight end position. So if you have another option that you like more, that's fine. But Andrews, still your tight end 7 so far on the season. He's a perfectly fine start. Isaiah Likely is dealing with a hamstring injury. Not really a player that I trust in my starting lineup. Was only on the field for 30% of snaps this past week. So I'm going to avoid Isaiah Likely this week and until we see some sort of a consistent pattern on the season. So there's your Thursday night matchup. We're basically rolling with our studs, and then we got Mike Gesicki as a solid option at the tight end position in terms of a streaming candidate here in week 10. Moving along to Sunday, we have an early game overseas. We're going to have the Giants squaring off against the Carolina Panthers. So what are we going to do here with Danny Dimes coming off of a good fantasy performance in week 9, 24.3 fantasy points, 2 passing touchdowns, 54 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, only 174 passing yards. Sure, if you're very desperate, you could go out and stream Daniel Jones. I just don't trust him. It is a good matchup, but also these overseas games can get a little wonky. I just feel like there's other options out there that you can roll with. You look at the past 3 weeks before week 9, 7.6, 5.9, 12.8. Very, very, very bad fantasy performances. And overall, this season has been a bit of a roller coaster in terms of fantasy performances for Daniel Jones. So, yes, it's a good matchup. Sure, if you're desperate enough, fine, you can start Daniel Jones, but I just don't personally want to. The Panthers are giving up the 29th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, so the opportunity is there, but I'm going to try and avoid Daniel Jones. I think there are more stable streaming options out there. But I do like Theo Johnson, who's coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season so far with 14.1 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 51 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So this is a good matchup. I think he's a viable option going into the week if you're very desperate at the position. I just don't quite know that a lot of you guys are going to have to go out there and stream Theo Johnson, but he sits at just 5% rostered. I think he's a good option if you're looking for a streaming candidate at tight end. Now, Bryce Young, Andy Dalton, I'm not really sure who's starting this week. I'm assuming it's Bryce Young, but I guess Andy Dalton could get back into the mix here. I'm not going to start either of the Panthers quarterbacks. You know, Bryce Young, his best day arguably on the season was this past week. I guess really week 8 against Denver, and he had 15 fantasy points. This past week felt like an improvement against the Saints, and he only had 10 fantasy points. So, yeah, I'm just staying away here, whether it's Bryce Young or Andy Dalton comes back from the thumb injury, whatever. I would imagine with the Panthers winning last week, even if Andy Dalton's good to go, it's probably going to be Bryce Young, but I'm just staying away. Then I'm still going to stay away from any Panthers tight end. Jatavion Sanders, really the guy here. We haven't really seen a lot of volume to any other option here. And Sanders has been okay over the past 4 weeks, don't get me wrong. And the Giants have struggled against opposing tight ends, giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to the position. So Jatavion Sanders, maybe not fair for me to say Theo Johnson's a streaming option, but Jatavion Sanders is not. Sanders, another guy, sits at 7% rostered. Maybe you could roll with this week if you're very desperate, but the Panthers have just been so weak against opposing tight ends that I feel better about Theo Johnson than I do Jatavion Sanders. But then again, what position are you in that you really need to stream Theo Johnson or Jatavion Sanders this week? I'm not sure. Overall, this matchup, not the best defenses, but I just don't want to take the risk on any Giants or Panthers quarterbacks or tight ends for the most part here in week 10. Moving along to Sunday afternoon, we got the Patriots traveling to face the Bears. So let's take a look at rookie Drake May, who has a tough matchup here. The Bears allowing the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I have an asterisk next to his name. I think he's an okay streaming option, but due to the matchup, this is not really a week that I want to start Drake May. Didn't love him last week. He did come through with at least 17 fantasy points. Still threw 2 interceptions, 1 passing touchdown, but Drake May is getting it done on the ground. 18 or more rushing yards in all of his starts, 38 or more rushing yards in 3 out of 4 starts, 95 yards on the ground against the Titans. So, I mean, that's nice. There's a little bit of upside from that, but yeah, I just don't really want to go out of my way to stream Drake May, but he's an okay floor option this week. I wouldn't expect much more than 17, 18 fantasy points out of him this week. And one sneaky line I like on Underdog this week is Drake May to throw a passing touchdown. I know the matchup is not that great here, but in his full starts on the season, he has thrown a passing touchdown in every game. So I think this is a nice sneaky line on Underdog. I would be hitting straight to Underdog to take the over on Drake May to throw just 1 touchdown. And don't forget, all new users on Underdog are getting a free NFL pick 'em for the week. Take your free pick 'em, take the over on Drake May's passing touchdowns. Once both of those lines hit, you guys are going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up with promo code The Catch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Now, Hunter Henry, I think, is a strong streaming option. I would put him in the start category, but the Bears have also been very good against tight ends, giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the position. But we've seen when Drake May's quarterback, Hunter Henry's been very consistent over the past 4 weeks, 9.5 or more fantasy points in every game that Drake May has played in. I know he left early in week 8, but in full games with Drake May, 12.6 or more fantasy points. So Hunter Henry will get that volume, 5 or more targets in every game in the past 4 weeks. I'm okay with streaming Hunter Henry. I would have him in the start category if the matchup was not as daunting. So I do like Henry this week, but maybe temper expectations for a high ceiling. Now, the Bears, I just don't want to do it. It's a good matchup here. It's a good matchup actually, I take that back. The Patriots have moved up a bit, so it's not really a good matchup. So that makes me feel better about sitting Caleb Williams and Cole Kmet. The Patriots are giving up the 14th fewest fantasy points to both quarterbacks and tight ends. So I just can't do it. We look back on the season for Caleb Williams, 19 fantasy points against the Colts, 23 against the Panthers, 29 against the Jags, 11.4 or less in every other game. I just don't really think anyone's in a position outside of like super flex formats where they have to start Caleb Williams. And in that case, I'm trying to avoid Caleb Williams. And Cole Kmet, since he came back from the bye week, just hasn't been very good. I know he ranks high. He's a tight end 8 on the season, but 25 points against the Colts, 24 against the Jags, 8.7 against the Panthers, 6.7 or less in every other matchup, 4.4 or less in each of the last 2 matchups, a goose egg this past week against Arizona. So I have no interest in starting Caleb Williams or Cole Kmet this week. You'd have to be desperate for me to want to see those guys in your starting lineups. Next up, we got a good one between the Niners and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Brock Purdy coming off a bye week. His last 3 fantasy starts, 20 or more fantasy points. Keep him in your starting lineup. The Bucs are giving up the second most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. Purdy's your QB10 so far on the year. Strong start, good matchup. Keep rolling with the punches. Start Brock Purdy. George Kittle has had a phenomenal season. Bye week last week, and he is still the tight end 1 on the season, and that also includes week 3 where he did not play. He has 14.5 or more fantasy points in every start this year except for week 1 against the Jets. Yeah, we're going to start George Kittle no matter what, regardless of the matchup. And the Bucs did not look so strong against Travis Kelce this past week. Speaking of the Bucs, Baker Mayfield just continues to find a way to get it done. I was a little worried about him against Kansas City. Didn't expect a high ceiling week, and he only had 18 fantasy points. But all things considered, Jalen McMillan not playing. We're throwing to just complete, no offense, nobodies. Sterling Shepard, just 4 receptions. We're really looking at guys like Ryan Miller getting 3 targets, 1 catch for a touchdown. Trey Palmer, 4 targets, 2 grabs. It's Cade Otton, Rashad White, Bucky Irving. Those are the guys that we're actually throwing to primarily here. And up against a good Chiefs defense, still threw in the rain for 200 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. So better matchup this week against the Niners, although they haven't been bad against the quarterback position, giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points, but still better matchup than the Chiefs this past week. I'm going to expect no rain in this game, hopefully. So Baker, just keep rolling with them. He's a QB2 on the season. It's very, very hard to bench Baker Mayfield. And don't forget, after the bye week, the schedule gets a lot better for the Bucs, and Mike Evans should be back. Now, Cade Otton, told you guys Sunday morning's video, you can flex Cade Otton. You can start Cade Otton. You should have Cade Otton in your starting lineup if you own him. 21.7 fantasy points against the Chiefs, who are giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the position going into week 9. 11 targets, 8 grabs, 77 receiving yards, and a tutty. Almost had a second one. Continue to start Cade Otton. This is a good matchup for both the quarterback and tight end position. We should be starting everyone involved here in week 10. Moving along, we have the Denver Broncos traveling to face the Kansas City Chiefs. What do we do with Bo Nix? A little bit of a disappointing week 9 against the Ravens. Good matchup. Coming off that big performance in week 8 against the Panthers with 29 fantasy points. He still got you 18 fantasy points. He's the QB8 on the season. 19 of 33, just 223 passing yards, a pick, 36 yards on the ground, but he did catch a touchdown. That's right, Bo Nix. Receiver we never knew we needed. So Bo Nix, a solid streaming option. Nothing more than that. The Chiefs still a tough matchup, giving up the 16th fewest fantasy points to the position. So not my favorite streaming option. He's going to be looking a little bit better against teams like the Raiders in Week 12 or the Browns in Week 13. But I do like Bo Nix. I think he's a solid floor option. Any tight end on this team, Lucas Krull, Greg Dulcich, Adam Trotman, just stay away from these guys. They are not fantasy relevant. Now, Patty Mahomes. Told you guys, I think Patrick Mahomes might have a pretty dang good game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was a good matchup. 24.5 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns. The first time this year Patrick Mahomes has thrown for 3 passing touchdowns. Just the third time this year he has thrown for over 290 passing yards. So it is a tough matchup against the Denver Broncos, giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to the position, but come on. You own Mahomes. Keep rolling with it. It's been good the past 2 weeks. You can start him. You got someone else you like more, that's fine too. But Mahomes at least giving us some life, even while the Chiefs are dealing with all of those injuries. Travis Kelce been very good the past 2 weeks as well. 22 fantasy points in Week 9, 16 targets, 14 grabs, 100 receiving yards. Keep rolling with Travis Kelce, even in a tough matchup here. Noah Gray, nothing this past week. 1 target, 0 catches. He's going to be a sit for me here in Week 10. Next up, we have the Bills traveling to face the Colts. And I'm hoping this game is not a one-sided affair, but let's start with the Bills. Josh Allen been super great the past 4 weeks. 20 or more fantasy points in every matchup. The QB4 on the season, 23.1 fantasy points in Week 9. 3 passing touchdowns, a pick, 235 passing yards, just 7 yards on the ground. But obviously a great fantasy stat line. You start Josh Allen no matter what. Not a lot to discuss there. Dalton Kincaid, keep rolling with the punches. I know it's not fantastic here. You got another option that maybe has more upside, a better matchup. That's fine. But Kincaid has 7.2 or more fantasy points in his last 4 starts, 7.2 or more fantasy points in every start since Week 3, except for Week 5 against the Texans. So tight end 12 on the season. It really does kind of suck that the ceiling that we thought could potentially be there for Kincaid this season has not been there, but nonetheless, he's a good floor option. Joe Flacco, Anthony Richardson, whatever. We're sitting these guys. The Vikings were giving up the 31st most fantasy points to the quarterback position going into Week 9, but they game planned very well against Joe Flacco and company. 4.06 fantasy points, a lost fumble, a pick, 179 passing yards, -1 rushing yard for Flacco in Week 9. Yeah, no thank you. Not even a streaming option this week. Any tight end involved for the Colts, stay away from them. All we're looking at here are the Bills starting players here in Week 10. Next up, we have the Steelers traveling to face the Commanders. Russell Wilson, I think, is a solid streaming option this week. I know this Commanders defense, not too bad, but they did kind of struggle this past week, giving up the 17th most fantasy points to the position so far on the season. So they're kind of right there in the middle. Russell should have had another touchdown, maybe 2 touchdowns in Week 8 on top of the 1 touchdown he did throw, 2 negated by penalties. So I think Russell Wilson played a lot better than that 13.8 fantasy stat line that we got in Week 8 against the Giants, 24.8 fantasy points in Week 7 against the Jets. So he's a solid streaming option, but I don't know if the ceiling is crazy high. We'll find out. And honestly, I love Russell Wilson's current passing yard line on Underdog, sitting at 220.5 total passing yards. He has hit that in his last 2 starts. I think that this Commanders defense is good, but the secondary is still a bit weak. I think Russell Wilson can easily get this done. So I would be heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Russell Wilson's total passing yards. Take the over here. Get that free NFL pick 'em from Underdog when you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch. Once both of those lines hit, you guys are going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Pat Freiermuth, I mean, some of you guys will look at this and say, sit Pat Freiermuth. I mean, yeah, like, he has 1 double-digit performance on the season, then 1 9.2 performance. Other than that, he's at 7.9 or less points in every game. I don't quite think we can keep rolling with Pat Freiermuth. Commanders, okay, 16th against tight ends. What's the upside here? I just don't think that there's anything there that makes me excited about starting Pat Freiermuth. Jaden Daniels, on the other hand, I would definitely be excited to start the QB3 so far on the season. You take away week 7 against the Panthers where he left early. We only have one game on the season where Jaden Daniels has under 19.8 fantasy points. He's a very good option. We're going to continue to roll with him regardless of the matchup. Zach Ertz gave us a stinker this past week, and it is a tough matchup as the Steelers are allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So I don't know that Zach Ertz is my favorite streaming option, but I believe in this Commanders offense. They're at home. He's got to be involved. We're not seeing a ton of involvement out of the wide receiver position outside of Terry McLaurin. I know Noah Brown's been a little bit more involved the past 2 weeks, but still, there's going to be volume there for Zach Ertz this week. Hopefully he can bounce back. Not the strongest streaming candidate at tight end, but he is still certainly an option going into week 10. Next up, we got the Vikings traveling to face the Jaguars. And I told you guys, going into week 9, keep rolling with the punches when it comes to Sam Darnold, and that's what we're going to do going into week 10. 21 fantasy points in week 9, 290 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, did throw 2 picks, but didn't matter. Still had over 20 fantasy points. And this matchup against the Jags, come on. We're starting Sam Darnold as the Jags are giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position, and they are also giving up the 29th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They have been a funnel for opposing tight ends. Told you guys, don't start Hawkinson in his first start. Nice to see him get involved. 4 targets, 3 grabs, 27 receiving yards, 5.7 fantasy points, but ultimately I think Hawkinson will be a good start this week. I think we'll get more volume out of him. And this matchup, I've told you guys for the past couple of weeks, we start tight ends against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. So let's roll with TJ Hawkinson this week. Now, Trevor Lawrence, on the other hand, I think I don't want to go out of my way to start Trevor Lawrence as the Vikings have moved up to 11th against the quarterback position with that stance they had last week. And I think that there's a strong chance that they game plan pretty well for T-Law. But he's found a way over the past couple weeks to continuously be a streaming option and play from behind, keep his team somewhat in the mix. They're constantly throwing because their defense is so bad. I put an asterisk next to his name. He's not my favorite streaming option, but if you're desperate, he has 18 or more fantasy points in every game since week 5 outside of week 7 against the Patriots. So 21.5 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. Not my favorite streaming option, especially because he wasn't very good through the air against Philly. He just found a way to have 2 rushing touchdowns, but ultimately, you're desperate. I think he's an okay desperation stream. Evan Engram continues to be a solid start. Since his return from the week 1 injury, 8.5 or more fantasy points in every game, 11.5 or more in 3 out of those 4 games. 10 targets this past week, 5 catches, 45 receiving yards, 11.5 fantasy points. Keep rolling with Evan Engram. I'm a little worried about the Jags in this matchup against that Vikings defense, but I think that Evan Engram has to remain in starting lineups going into week 10. Next up, we have the Falcons traveling to face the Saints. Tough matchup here for Kirk Cousins this week, and I do have my concerns when we really break down Kirk Cousins' season. We have 17.5 fantasy points in week 2, 17.7 in week 9 this past week. Then 2 games against the Bucs where he had 28 or more fantasy points and threw 8 touchdowns through those 2 games. But every other game, 12.1 or less fantasy points. So I do kind of worry on the road here going up against the Saints, giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But I think he's probably a strong start at the same time because I don't really trust that Saints defense. So Cousins, I will say, is not my favorite start this week. But if you don't have anything better, he's certainly still startable. Just depends on who else you have on your roster. Now, Kyle Pitts smacked us across the face this past week. Welcome to the Kyle Pitts experience. 2.1 fantasy points, 1 target, 1 catch, 11 receiving yards. I'll probably still start Kyle Pitts on a weekly basis if I own him. The Saints right there in the middle, giving up the 17th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So not a bad matchup, not a great matchup, but Kyle Pitts, I think we keep rolling with him, even coming off of a down week. Every other performance for the past 4 weeks before that, you got double digits. All right, Taysom Hill, I think, is a solid streaming option. The Falcons giving up the 19th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, so they're not great against opposing tight ends. And the last time the Saints and Falcons played, Taysom Hill had 14.4 fantasy points. So he was a good stream this past week because he got the Panthers, but this is also a pretty good matchup that he performed well in earlier in the season. And overall, this team is decimated with injuries, so they're going to have to rely on Taysom Hill. I don't want to look at Jawan Johnson. I don't want to look at Foster Moreau. I know every now and then they do something. Foster Moreau had a touchdown this past week, but there's no ceiling there with those guys. We're not starting them. And I have no interest in starting Derek Carr either. It's not a bad matchup, I'll say that much. The Falcons have kind of struggled against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 26 most fantasy points, but I just don't want to start Derek Carr. I don't see a very high ceiling there. So see what happens. Should be a nice divisional matchup here in Week 10. Next up, we have the Titans traveling to face the Chargers. I'm not starting anyone on the Titans, which might not be fair, as Mason Rudolph has 18.5 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. But on the road here against a Chargers defense giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position, I'm just not going to do it. I just can't risk it. You're super desperate in a double quarterback super flex league, he'll probably get you points, but I'm not risking it against this Chargers defense, and I don't want to start any tight end on this Titans team as well. So stay away from the Titans players, quarterback and tight end here in Week 10. Now, Justin Herbert, on the other hand, is throwing the football. We're not just running the football for the Chargers. So 19.4 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts, 279 or more passing yards in his last 3 starts, 4 passing touchdowns in his last 2 starts. Thank goodness, right? So he gets the Titans this week. He's a solid streaming option as they are giving up the 15th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. I still don't know if the ceiling's super high for Justin Herbert. They're still going to try and run the football first and foremost, especially as the Titans have now started to really struggle against opposing running backs. But Herbert is still certainly a good option this week, but temper your expectations for a high ceiling. Now, I got Will Dissly in the streaming category. You need points. You can plug in Will Dissly. It's not a great matchup. There's probably better options, so he gets an asterisk. The Titans have been good against opposing tight ends, giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the position on the season. So not my favorite tight end streaming candidate, but he's been pretty solid over the past 4 weeks if we take away Week 9. So overall, this is not a matchup that I think is going to be very fantasy robust when it comes to quarterbacks and tight ends, so I'm going to try and avoid this matchup if possible. Next up, we have the Jets traveling to face the Cardinals, and I had Aaron Rodgers as a good streaming option this past week, knowing that the Texans had struggled against the quarterback and wide receiver position. He had 3 passing touchdowns, 20 fantasy points, pretty solid. This week he gets the Cardinals, and they've looked better over the past couple weeks, but they're still giving up the 21st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I still like Aaron Rodgers as a solid streaming option this week. Depends on who you have, all that stuff, but I'm definitely good with starting him here in Week 10. Tyler Conklin, I just can't trust him. 0.7 fantasy points after having 13.2 fantasy points. I'm going to avoid Tyler Conklin this week. I don't have a lot of faith in him being a consistent option. Plus, tight end play has been better as of late, so you probably don't feel like you need to go out and start him. Kyler Murray, 4.76 fantasy points. What in the world happened against the Chicago Bears this past week? Let's try not think too much about it because Kyler Murray's still a top 10 quarterback so far on the season. The Jets have been good against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 5th fewest fantasy points. It depends on who else you have. But I'm going to go ahead and try and take the upside in Kyler Murray if I own him this week. If you don't like the matchup, that's fine. You can sit him. The Cardinals get their bye week in Week 11. I think things will look a little bit better after the bye week if this does prove to be a tough matchup. But ultimately, if I own Kyler Murray, I will probably swing with the punches, take what I can get here. But it is worrisome with the matchup and coming off of last week's performance. Trey McBride, on the other hand, has been very good. Double digits in every game since week 5. Double digits in every game that he started except for 2 on the season. He gets the Jets this week. Yeah, it's a little bit of a tough matchup, but don't let it scare you. Trey McBride is in your starting lineup in week 10, no matter what. Next up is the Eagles traveling to face the Cowboys. Jalen Hurts has been fantastic over the past couple weeks since the Eagles came back from their bye week. 29.9 fantasy points in week 9, 2 passing touchdowns, a rushing touchdown, 230 yards through the air, 67 yards on the ground. He has had 6 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. Yes, start Jalen Hurts no matter what, and this Cowboys team, they do not scare me, to say the least. Now, Dallas Goedert has been missing in action for the past couple weeks. If he plays this week, sure, fire him up, but it really depends on who else you have, and he might not even play this week as he continues to nurse that hamstring injury. So if he plays, he's fine. He's Goedert. We know what we can get. We know what the ceiling is. We know what the floor is, all of that stuff. If you own Goedert, sure, you can roll with him this week. Grant Calcaterra, if he comes in relief of Dallas Goedert, he's a fine start as well, but nothing more than a streaming option. And I'll just say that I'm okay starting Goedert or Calcaterra this week just because it's the Cowboys, and they might be one of the least intimidating defenses right now in the NFL. On the other hand, for the Cowboys, Jake the Snake Ferguson, we can roll with him. 14.1 fantasy points, a little bit of Dak last week, a little bit of Cooper Rush, 10 targets, 7 catches, 71 receiving yards. He's one of the only players offensively that we can have any faith in when it comes to the Cowboys right now. Dak Prescott going to probably head to IR as he deals with that hamstring injury, going to be missing a couple of weeks here. That leaves Cooper Rush as the next man up. I'm not starting Cooper Rush. This Eagles defense has looked much better over the past couple weeks. They're giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. You'd have to be truly desperate in a Superflex double quarterback league. And in a Superflex league, I'd probably just flex a running back or wide receiver. Let's stay away from Cooper Rush this week. Everyone else in this matchup, though, should at least be somewhat solid here in week 10. All right, Sunday Night Football, we got a good one between the Lions and the Texans. So let's continue to roll with Jared Goff. I mean, I think he's a solid start. The Texans have struggled against the position, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I know Goff was not good last week from a fantasy perspective. 18 of 22, 145 passing yards and a passing touchdown. I know it's been a little bit up and down here, but I would continue to roll with Jared Goff if you have no better options. If you have better options, start them. But similar to last week with Aaron Rodgers, I like starting quarterbacks against this Texans defense right now. So I think he's a solid option to start, but maybe it doesn't have the most upside. Sam Laporta, you can start him if you need to. You don't have to. Depends on who else you have. Past 4 weeks, double digits, single digit, double digits, single digit. It's just back and forth here. Depends on this offense. They're doing so many things well, getting so many different players involved. You're just not always going to see a good stat line from Sam Laporta. He is not what he was in his rookie season, unfortunately. So he's an okay start. Depends on who else you have. It is a good matchup, though, as the Texans have given up the 28th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So bear that in mind. He's probably a solid start, but it's just like, come on. And when it comes to CJ Stroud, it's definitely like, come on, man. What is going on here? 12.4 or less fantasy points in his last 3 matchups. The Lions giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So, you want to start Stroud? Go for it. Nico Collins should and could definitely be back this week, which I think could change things for Stroud. And this Lions defense has not been very good against opposing wide receivers. So there's that. It depends on who you have. But I'm just not excited to start CJ Stroud right now from a fantasy perspective. And I'm not excited to start Dalton Schultz either. His ceiling on the season is 9.2 fantasy points, 7.4 fantasy points or less in every other matchup. So there should be a good game script here at the very least, but I'm just not overly excited about this matchup from a quarterback or tight end perspective here in week 10. And last but not least, we have the Dolphins traveling to face the Rams for Monday Night Football. I think Tua is a solid streaming option this week. The Rams have given up the 20th most fantasy points to the quarterback position, so he looked good this past week. He looked good in week 8. This past week, 25 of 28, 231 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Good enough matchup here. You don't have anything better. You need to stream somebody. He's on your bench. He sits at 55% rostered. He's a good start. I don't know if the ceiling's crazy high. Johnny Smith, another guy, probably not a super high ceiling, but a good enough start going into the week. He's been pretty solid over the past couple weeks. The Rams have really struggled against opposing tight ends, giving up the 26th most fantasy points. So he sits at 16% rostered. You need some points. Your tight end's on bye week. Johnny Smith is a player you can stream this week. Now, the Dolphins have been very good against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the position, but I trust Matthew Stafford. He has looked back to regular over the past 2 weeks, throwing for 279 or more passing yards in his last 2 starts, and for 6 passing touchdowns in his last 2 starts, 18.9 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts, with a healthy Cooper Kupp, healthy Puka Nacua, as long as he's not throwing punches. And overall, it is a tough matchup here. Don't get me wrong, this Miami Dolphins pass defense has been pretty good so far on the season. But I'll go ahead and roll with Matthew Stafford. I mean, maybe he's closer to a streaming option, but he's an okay start this week no matter what. Colby Parkinson, a goose egg last week. He has just not been involved. He's not a fantasy factor at the tight end position whatsoever. So really, we got 2 good streaming options with Tua, Johnny Smith, and Matthew Stafford, maybe in between a streaming option and a start. Nonetheless, should be a good Monday night matchup. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single quarterback, every single tight end, and who you guys should be starting or sitting as we move into week 10 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'll answer every single comment on today's video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. So if you guys have any fantasy questions, drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I can. And most importantly, we're going to have everything you guys could possibly need here on the channel as week 10 progresses to help you guys dominate this week of fantasy football. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.